Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Walker, the manager of athlete development here at USA Volleyball. And today I have the privilege to be joined by Erin Brock, who is our director of sports medicine and performance here at USA Volleyball. So Erin has joined us today to talk a little bit about some of the most common injuries we might see in volleyball and what coaches can actually do when it comes to addressing these injuries in their athletes. Thanks for joining us, Erin.
Thank you.
So to give our audience a little bit of a summary here, within your work within the sport of volleyball, what are some of the most common injuries that we see that coaches are likely to see in their athletes?
Yeah, I think whether you're working with national team athletes or young age group athletes, there's a lot of commonality that you can see with the injuries. And from an acute standpoint, there can be some acute knee injuries. The ankle injuries are the most common. You can have some finger sprains at times, but I think from an acute injury standpoint, the ankle sprains would be the main place to focus on. But as you know, most injuries that occur in volleyball are over time. It's common to have more time loss or disability or decreased performance from injuries that have developed over time, overuse injuries, as opposed to acute injuries, even though, they do both happen. So, I think the number one would be the knees. And obviously there's a lot of things that can go wrong with knees, but I think the common overuse type of injuries in the knees are the tendons, and primarily the quadricep tendon, patellar tendon, that anterior chain, that anterior pulley takes a lot of load jumping and landing. And so I think that's going to be one of the premier places that you're going to see some injury taking hold. Also shoulders, and there's various shoulder pathologies that can occur. But I'd say backs are probably the third. So probably knees, shoulders, backs are mostly what we're looking at. And it's pretty rare that someone who's been playing for a significant number of years, they're on the national team, that they don't have some history of knee pain, shoulder pain, perhaps back pain. And although the pathologies, the specific structures that can be involved in those injuries can vary, I think there's a lot of commonalities between a lot of these injuries that you're seeing from the national team athletes, some of the older athletes who have accrued a lot of years under their belt, or some of the younger athletes who are just starting out. I think those injury patterns still remain pretty consistent.
As we think about our athletes growing up through their sport experience, maybe when they enter club volleyball to entering a collegiate or national team pipeline, you just said that really we see a lot of commonality in injuries. Is there any variation in injury patterns with age when it comes to the load capacity, or maybe what load they're taking on? So if we have a youth athlete who's playing year-round and doesn't necessarily get a break, does that build up into overuse injuries in a similar way it might with an older athlete, or not so much that's different than that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know when that tipping point is of what's too much, because on one hand, you look at our national team athletes who don't have off seasons. They play internationally professional volleyball when they're not playing for Team USA, and so they're playing year round. And on one hand, that develops what we call a nice chronic workload. And that means your system has adapted to this stress, and they do develop tolerance to some of those stresses. Now, at some point, it can be too much. And I think for younger athletes, you need to definitely take care that it's not too much, what's too much? It's hard to say, and that's the tricky part with this. But I will say that when you have an adolescent athlete, a younger athlete who doesn't have the strength base, the ability to have created that athletic armor, for lack of a better term, that resiliency, that the athletes, as they get older, they've gone through a lot of body changes and strengthening programs, and I think that builds resiliency. Playing volleyball can build resiliency as well, but as you know, it's a very uniform type of activity, where if you're just playing volleyball, you're getting strong in certain ways that volleyball, playing the sport, will allow you to become strong at. If you're not doing some additional strength training type of programming, then I don't think that's a very good recipe for long-term health. But if you are creating some adaptability in your system through loads of strength training in addition to loads of volleyball that can kind of, go together, then I think you are able to create a little bit of resiliency there to hopefully stave off some of these, overuse injuries. And so when you're younger, that program is going to look a lot different than when you're older. But I'm still an advocate for some type of performance training for younger athletes who are really just trying to learn basic movements. And you have a qualified, strength and conditioning coach that can help kind of guide them through learning these movement patterns. You're not loading them up and, making them lift heavy weights. It's more movement focused to get them to learn proper mechanics of, how to move their body in an efficient and effective way. That's going to help them, on the volleyball court as well. And I think you can build up some resiliency in that way. And then as you get older and you get more familiar with these movements, now you can, put some load onto those movements. And I think that creates robustness. And without a proper designed, and it doesn't have to be some fancy designed program, but I think without some performance training to offset the volleyball, it could be trouble. If you're just playing volleyball and not really doing anything else, you can really, I think, go down the road of too much load pretty easily. But maybe you can be okay with that load if your system has the capacity to handle that load. And I think that's where some of the performance training comes in. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question.
You did. Yeah, you hit it right on the head. So as we think about that, a lot of our club coaches may or may not have access to a strength and conditioning coach.
Yep.
So if we're thinking about trying to build a more robust system and maybe our younger athletes, rather than just have it be only volleyball on the court, what are some recommendations you might have for those coaches who don't have the S&C?
Yeah, and so, I would say that the profession of strength and conditioning has become quite professional and has grown a ton. And so if you don't have somebody, take a look around. Maybe there is somebody that could at least help guide the process. I think it's nice to be able to have somebody there in person. Maybe not every time, maybe there's some court type of strengthening program that could be designed by somebody and then, monitored by the coach over time. But at the younger age groups, 14, 15, 16, maybe even into 17, you're running into athletes who are still growing, still trying to learn how to use their body. And it's good to have somebody who can put some eyes on them and help correct some technique, help give them some cues, help give them an idea of what kind of proper mechanics and techniques are supposed to be. And so first and foremost, I'd suggest at least looking around to see if you could find somebody. Obviously, it takes resources, and hopefully there could be some resource allocation to this, because I think it is very helpful. If you don't have a strength and conditioning coach, then you're going to have to upskill yourself. And not saying you're going to become an elite strength and conditioning coach, but you don't need to. I think if you can learn some basics, you learn some basic movements, something's better than nothing. And I think that it would be important to, try to find a way to expose their bodies to something other than volleyball. And that can look a lot of ways, but I think the best way to do that is through some kind of, strength training. And when you say strength training, people picture big bars with a bunch of weights on it and doing crazy stuff. And it really can just be as simple as, movements, body weight movements that, you're going to be able to at least tax the system and stress the system a little bit differently to ask something else of that system other than volleyball. So the body's going to adapt to whatever demands gets put on. And so if you put some other demands on it, from different movements that can create a little bit of robustness, I think that's what you're looking for. But it is hard if you're a coach without a professional to help guide the process. So number one, if you can look for that, but number two, if not, upskill yourself with a little bit of knowledge just to kind of get something started.
What I really love about that is just the practicality of it, right? Is saying, hey, as a coach, you have to wear a million hats, but maybe you don't have to wear that hat. Right?
Yeah.
There might be strength and conditioning programs at a university where the students are doing an internship or things where you might be able to get access to some of that knowledge and expertise in a shorter term commitment.
Yeah, well, and I think once athletes get to college, they're going to be exposed in some capacity to these kinds of programs. And these kinds of programs are trying to make them healthy and better at their sport. And so you're trying to, we always say here at USA Volleyball that we're trying to enhance performance and improve well-being. So there's a health component to this that's going to make you more healthy in general, but it's also potentially going to enhance your performance. And so I think that collegiate programs see that, they value that, they've bought into that, and they're going to surround the athletes with whatever they can from a strength and conditioning, performance training support. It's just prior to that it's very up to the parents or the coach. If the coach is going to drive the club team having access to a strength coach with a little weight room or whatever, because I've seen a lot of variation in how that's, practically implemented, because it is hard. You have to have a space, you have to have a professional. If you're really going to do it, if you don't have that and you have a coach with no equipment, you can still get some things done and at least start down that path. You're not going to be able to surround the athletes with, something like college would have. But I think for us on the national team level, when you see people who have had some kind of exposure to performance training or strength training before they get into college, now they get into college and they can actually start making some gains. They can make some progress. They can actually develop as opposed to just starting to figure it out. So certainly the strength training side is huge. I think first and foremost, even if you don't wrap it around this program of strength training, let's say that you're trying to protect your knees, there's a handful of things that you can do to do that. And it doesn't have to be this full-on complex strength training program, but I don't think any injury prevention program that doesn't have some exercises in it, I don't think it's going to work very well. And so that's where first and foremost, I think strength is the number one thing, but we could also go down the roads of, various, mobility, some range of motion and some mobility through different joints, and some other things that you can do with some myofascial release devices that kind of take some tension off, elongating the muscles, improving the mobility. That certainly plays in with injury prevention, but I think first and foremost, especially with adolescent athletes, typically tightness and lack of mobility is not their problem. It's more strength and kind of neuromuscular coordination.
Yeah. So kind of thinking in that motion of other things that coaches might be able to do that can act in an injury preventative way for some of the young athletes. What are you going to tell the coach to go out and do on the court or in their practice or in their season to protect their athletes?
Yeah. First and foremost, and this is hard because usually your big jumpers are your big, players that are getting a lot. Protect your big jumpers. It's not surprising that a recent research article correlated knee pain, knee tendon injury with how high you jump. All right, you're jumping high, you're landing from a high place. Makes sense, right? But it was interesting to see this validated in some actual pretty good peer-reviewed research. But the big jumpers are at most risk. And those are probably the ones that are getting a lot of sets. You're probably not wanting to take them out of your lineup very often. If you could do right by the athlete and really protect your big jumpers. And so if that's something like, hey, we're doing this practice and, we're working on hitting technique because a lot of these guys need it. Maybe my big jumpers don't need that. So let's just stay down. That saves them 15 jumps in a practice. It's probably worth it. Obviously trying to find that rhythm of they can't play every game at this tournament where you're playing 10 matches in 3 days. Try to find a way to just decrease some of the jumps. And so this is something we'll do with the national teams where we have some more fancy ways to measure, workload. But the idea of when you're jumping the athletes, be intentional. Don't just jump. Just to jump. If you're asking the athletes to jump, even if they're 14 years old, they've never had knee pain, it's no problem yet, just protect your jumpers. And if you're going to jump them, which you are, volleyball, you have to jump a lot. And so I get it. But when you're going to design a practice, when you're creating lineups for tournaments, just have that in your mind. Have it in your mind of how much jumping this athlete has had. And if there's any way to save your big jumpers some jumps, do away with those mindless jumps. You know, those drills that maybe they're jumping 50 times in that 10-minute drill. It's like, try to be a little bit more intentional, you know. And the kids, they don't really do this with the national team anymore because they know their jumping is precious. But you see the kids and they're out there trying to dunk basketballs, and they're trying, you know, practice hasn't even started yet, and they're max jumping, you know, pulling on the net, trying to bounce one or whatever it might be. Try to discourage that. Try to discourage jumping until they're warmed up and prepared. So that'd be the other point. I think a solid warm up, and I know I'm talking about jumping a lot, but the same can go for shoulders, you know, and just backs in general. But we know the most provocative aspect of volleyball for the body is jumping and landing and swinging. And so I think that ties into the idea of warm up. Now, for younger athletes, does it need to be 15 minutes like we do? And what you don't see when you see our 15-minute warm up for the national teams, that every athlete has been in the weight room and training room for probably at least a half hour, if not longer, doing their own individual practice preparation. Sometimes that's designed by us. Hey, I want you to do this exercise, this mobility, this. Some of it's designed by us, but a lot of times the athletes start to know, oh, this helps me. This helps me be at my best for practice. This helps me not be in pain after practice. This helps me, you know, from a health standpoint and a performance standpoint. So over time, you know, the athletes really buy into this. It's hard to get them to buy in when they're young and invincible and they've had no pain in their lives, you know. So I would say that the warm-up piece is really vital. So if the coach can really promote a warm-up, even if it's something brief, at least it's something. I'd like the coaches to be able to communicate with the athletes and see how they're feeling. Now, do you need to talk to them every day? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? Okay, you don't need to go overboard, but if there's an athlete that you're seeing is moving a little bit off, or they look like they're favoring something, or they're just not looking quite right with their mechanics, that should be a sign that you should have a further conversation with them. Is there something wrong? Do you feel pain? And so I think if there's something that's painful for the athletes, you know, ideally there's a medical professional that could take a look at that and help guide, because, you know, a lot of times like, okay, that's cool, they can keep playing, just do these 3 things and it's going to get better. Or maybe there is a time where they would need to take some time off to do some treatments or do some things. But so I would really like the coaches to be very proactive in talking with the athletes, understanding if something's bothering them, modifying things if needed. You know, a lot of times the kids just either if the younger they are, it seems like they just are fairly dismissive of something that might be painful. Like, whatever, I'm not going to even, you know, bother by, you know, telling anybody about this. Or 2, they might think their coach is going to think that they're weak, or that it's something that's going to look negative upon them. And so I think we would just want to avoid those situations where the athlete isn't going to be forthcoming with how they're feeling, or that the coach isn't interested in how they're feeling. So I think the warm-up piece is good. The piece where they can communicate with the athletes and understand how they're feeling, and involving a medical professional if there's any question of how to proceed, and protecting the big jumpers with practice design. And I would just say, just make every jump count. When you're designing your practice, consider how much you're jumping. And that's what's been very kind of fun with the workload monitoring program that we've been doing now for the last few years with the national team athletes, is when we have some of this data and we're talking with the coaches about workloads, you know, the coaches are now like, okay, so these high workloads are coming from jumping and landing and swinging. So if I need to consider my overall workload for the practice, I know where the bulk of the workload's coming from. So they're just a little bit more intentional about what they're going to ask of the athletes from a jumping and swinging standpoint. So even if you don't have something that you're measuring these workloads with, which you don't need, you know, could you still just be mindful of how much you're jumping them, you know? And I think, you know, sometimes with the strength training, some people feel like plyometrics is the right thing. And usually it's not. And it's just more jumping. they're jumping a lot anyway. Just stop with the plyometrics. Unless there's like this off-season program or it's a well-designed program where they're not playing volleyball, and you're like, all right, hey, we got a very like intentionally designed training program that includes plyometrics. Okay, I'm not saying that there's never a time and a place, but it's pretty rare to have a time and a place for more jumping outside of jumping for volleyball. So I don't know, off the top of my head, I think those are the things that I would really encourage the coaches to consider, when it comes to, trying to protect the athletes.
Awesome. So on the general topic of sport injury within volleyball and things that coaches can be looking out for with their athletes, any other recommendations you would leave them with?
I think it would be helpful if you're, and I know I'm kind of doubling down on this comment of just kind of keeping communication lines open, but I think that's probably one of the biggest things is just keep communication lines open, be approachable. Hopefully the athletes can come to you and feel like, they can be honest and maybe a little vulnerable that something's bothering them. They don't want to lose playing time. They don't want to lose their spot. And so it can be a little bit of a nerving position for the athlete to be in, and keep the communication lines open with parents. I think that you can learn a lot just by quick conversation with the athlete, maybe having a parent involved in some capacity. But the biggest thing for me is just have this on your radar. I think it's just been a long time where just the overall health of the athlete just wasn't really top of mind. And it wasn't really considered when you're designing a practice. It wasn't really considered when you're creating rosters for your tournaments. And I would just ask to have that considered, and have the health of the athlete just be on the radar as you're going through trainings, as you're communicating with the athletes, as you're planning practice. Try to get work in some of the warm-ups. I think a post-practice cool down with a little bit of stretching exercises and a few things I think would be helpful as well. But I think things are changing where the idea of athlete well-being is a topic now, and I think that's a good thing just to have on the coach's radar. And obviously there's a lot of specifics that can be done, but I think in general that's probably the biggest one. I mean, the head coach is the main person that has the athlete's health in the palm of their hands. And I've always said that one of the best injury preventative aspects of a team is having a head coach that can understand how to manage the workload of these athletes. They got to train. They're gonna get better by training. There's a lot of volleyball to be played, but if you can do it in an intentional, intelligent way, I honestly think that regardless of what strength training program or all these rehab programs or all this wearable, technology that we're using to monitor workloads, I don't think any of that trumps a coach who cares about the athletes, cares about their health, and is willing to make that a part of their practice plan and overall team management.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today to share some basic expertise on most common injuries and how we can help coaches prevent those.
Thanks, anytime. Man. Yeah. Thank you. What I think would be kind of interesting too is that, as we're doing warm-ups, if we do a conversation about warm-ups, it's like, okay, here's some things I think about warm-ups and then we have, hey, go here and here's 10 examples, right? You could do something like, and again, it'd be fairly basic, like the conversation we were having earlier is I know there's a lot of nuance and context and it's hard to just throw out, hey, here, do these 8 exercises. But, there could be something like that where if we do have a conversation and I mention, hey, the knees, and the jumpers, coaches, and you're asking me what coaches can do. Yeah. And it's because they don't have the skill set, knowledge, experience, whatever. So it's hey, on our website or whatever, here's 3 different options for a knee kind of practice prep plan. Get there 5 minutes early, do these 5 things, right? And so, because I feel when you ask me what coaches can do, it's kind of I want to give them something tangible.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, that's just maybe something for another time. But it is always, I always feel like kind of want to give them more. You know what? You know, it's probably fine to just hear somebody blab about it like me, but I don't know. Does it does that actually like change anything? You know, does that get them doing something?